Salavalava. I am Karena Rosa Moyava Senga Masina Lyons, Director of the Pacific Islands Development Program and Vice President at the East-West Center. Aloha and welcome to the world premiere of EWC INSIGHTS featuring Pacific leaders. This online event series is a new flagship production for the Pacific Islands Development Program based here in Honolulu at the beautiful site of the East-West Center. This is a platform for important Pacific-oriented conversations, amplifying the voices of our region's leaders to inform, educate, and inspire. So it is fitting that joining me today from the lush and ancient paradise of Pohnpei is His Excellency, David Panuelo, President of the Federated States of Micronesia. Your Excellency, Kasululie.
Thank you, Ambassador Lyons. Kasululie Maing from Pohnpei, capital of our nation, Federated States of Micronesia. Aloha and Kirana to you, all of you and the audience that are out there. We thank you. What a pleasure to see you again, Ambassador. This time we'll have to do and be content with meeting virtually, but we look forward to welcoming you back to our islands again when COVID subsides.
I can't wait.
I thank you. I thank you, Ambassador. First, I would like to express my appreciation to the PIDP and the East-West Center for hosting this Insights with the Pacific Island leaders, where we truly appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation with you and your audience. I believe that there are many important issues out there that we can engage in that would be, I believe, would be very productive and engaging. So thank you for the opportunity.
Great. And I think the honor is ours, Mr. President, and I'm super excited. As promised, we have an ambitious set of topics to cover today, everything from regional politics to the economic impacts of COVID-19, to climate change, to FSM's relationship with its ally, the United States. So let's just get started. So, Mr. President, what does Pacific regionalism mean to you? And in particular, how do you envision the North Pacific's role within the Pacific Island Forum?
Thank you, Ambassador. I think, first of all, I would also want to begin by, expressing the FSM governments and its people, our prayers and sympathies to folks out there, to our citizens who are residing in the U.S., the citizens of the U.S., and of course the global community, because COVID-19 has impacted many lives. And we express our prayers and sympathies, condolences to all of you who have succumbed to COVID-19. Thank you, Ambassador. What a great pleasure again to see you. Pacific regionalism, what it means to me, that's a very important topic to talk about because when FSM became independent, and that was 1986 when we signed the treaty of our Compact of Reassociation with the United States. I recall that was during President Reagan's time. We signed it in 1986, which has evolved the FSM out of the trust territory of the Pacific Island status. At that time, I remember how one of the important foreign policy priorities was to have our presence be made in the South Pacific. So our embassy was opened in Fiji, and our presence with the Pacific became real because we were in the North, and having been under the U.S. administration, we felt that the regionalism is important, and therefore our integration with the Pacific Island nations who are neighbor to us, including the regional organizations. So really, Pacific regionalism to me literally means that the Pacific community comes together and then come to consensus on the very important issues that continue to face our respective countries, such as climate change, which has been one of the foremost topics that the region has come together on, among other important issues.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we will talk about climate change in just a minute, but sticking with the theme of regionalism, I think many of us are aware that there was recently a very important summit, the Micronesian President's Summit. So we would love to hear from you the key takeaways from the Micronesian President's Summit.
Yes, the Micronesian President's Summit, we recently held a meeting in Palau, and I thank our neighbor president, Remangasao, for hosting it. Unfortunately, I was not able to make it. Congress was in session. We have many topics and issues that was going on in the FSM, so I joined them virtually, and myself and President Mau Mau joined them virtually. And like the other sub-regions in our Pacific region, like the Melanesian countries, the Polynesian countries, the MPS is our organization that we come together to discuss similar issues of importance. And then so the Pacific Island, the MPS President Summit is one that easily, as you can see in the headline, item that news media focused on was our region's solidarity with one another, and our candidate to the next Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. That was in the news, as you may have seen. In New York, the presidents of the MPS met last year and signed a joint letter supporting our candidate. And so the fact of the matter is that the Micronesian presidents stand in strong solidarity with each other. And so the broadest takeaway from the MPS is that Micronesia is unified, regardless of the broader overarching topic. We're unified on climate change. We're unified on tackling corruption. We're unified on tackling illegal fishing. And we're unified on having our voices equal to other countries in the Pacific.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know our audience is actually very varied today, and a number of people are genuinely keen to hear about the priorities identified at the Micronesian President Summit. So thank you for outlining that. I think officials everywhere are grateful as they're carefully jotting down these notes. But obviously the key takeaway was the discussion about the race for the position of the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. And it's a really exciting time for the Pacific. Regional politics has never been so hot. I think for the first time ever, we have 5 candidates, and clearly we have a Micronesian candidate. So I just thought I should let you know that we have people tuning in from all around the Pacific and actually Asia as well, as far flung as Sri Lanka, I believe. So what do you think our audience should know about the current race for the Secretary General for the Pacific Islands Forum, for the position of chair of the Pacific Islands Forum? Secretary General, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it would be good to have a little bit of a perspective. I did talk about when we evolved out of the TTPI, or the Trust Area of the Pacific Islands, we valued integration with the Pacific Island countries. So we made our diplomatic presence in VG to be with our Pacific Island brothers and sisters of the Melanesian and Polynesian sub-regions. At the time, I think the PIF used to be called the South Pacific Islands Forum. And because of the presence of the North Pacific in the membership, it was changed to Pacific Islands Forum to be inclusive. And so today, we feel the Micronesian sub-region that based on that gentleman agreement, that we see the chance of leading the Pacific Islands Forum be given to all of the sub-regions. I think it's important for us to understand that leadership in the Pacific Islands Forum is also a testimony to our unity of all the sub-regions of the Pacific, Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not sure that many people know that there's actually never been a vote for the position of Secretary General. So it's going to be fascinating to see what happens, and I note your point about geographic representation. But I can't resist. I have to ask you a really difficult question. Who do you think is going to win?
Ambassador, we're very confident. We're very confident that our candidate will lead the way. And I take the opportunity today to humbly ask our, regional brothers and sisters, leadership in our region, to support our Micronesian candidate for the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, to bring equity in the leadership and bring unity and confidence in the leadership of the Pacific Islands Forum. Our candidate is very qualified, with skills of management and leadership qualities, diplomatic qualities, and even technical skills. Gerald Sakias is now the current ambassador to Washington, D.C. of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. He was heading up the sub-region office of SPC here in Bowen Bay, and many other qualities being a minister. And we believe the confidence and trust of our Pacific brothers and sisters in the next election of the candidate is an important one to show this confidence in the North Pacific. You know that East West Center Pacific Islands Development Program is the other only organization as a crop agency in the Pacific Islands Forum. And we value this development partnership with East West Center, PIDP. And that became an issue in the last meeting of the Pacific Islands Forum. We held the Pacific Islands Development Leaders meeting thereafter. I believe the issue came up, and PIDP East West Center played significant role then and continue to play a significant role now in the nation building of our respective countries in the North Pacific. Most of our founding fathers, as you know, were given opportunities to be trained, educated at the East West Center, and therefore they helped in the nation building of our nation building process of the FSM and the other fully associated states.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for humoring me as I put you on the spot like that. Obviously, PIDP and the East West Center does not get a vote, but we wish our friend Ambassador Zakios the best of luck, and just can't wait to see the outcome of that historic race. And so moving right along. Sorry, sir, please.
I was going to say that unity of the MPS countries, there are 5 of us out of the 16 members of the Pacific Islands Forum. Normally, Australia and New Zealand would wish to see the 14 members work it out. And, if we get 3 to 4 members of the PIF who support our 5 Pacific nations in the Micronesia sub-region, that would already be a consensus and majority in the membership composition of the members of the Pacific Islands Forum. So we look forward to the positive support of our the Polynesian and Melanesian brothers and sisters, and we're confident we're coming to the retreat of the Pacific Island leaders, which is coming up towards the late part of November.
And we too await the outcome. Oh, if only we could be a fly on that wall. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. Thank you, sir. I might move us along to the topic of economic recovery. Firstly, to highlight the success of the FSM government and people, because I think to date you are still completely free from COVID-19. But I would like to ask you about your key economic priorities for FSM as you recover from the economic impacts of COVID-19.
Ambassador Lyons, I first would like to talk about a little bit of the FSM's economy. Sure. FSM's economy is somewhat unique. I believe it's unique because fisheries is our largest revenue source. We also do have the Micronesian registers advisors program, where we register corporations from Japan, which are not physically based in the Federated States of Micronesia, but they pay corporate tax to our nation. So having all of these components of our economy, tourism is not really something that we rely on like the, like Hawaii, state of Hawaii, right, and the territory of Guam. So the impact of COVID-19, while it's hurting us, it's not hurting us like other nations whose economies are so largely dependent on tourism. So in the immediate term, we've been implementing the FSM Economic Stimulus Program, and I thank our FSM Congress for appropriating a stimulus program to assist our tourism sector. We're helping to give them some support in the salaries and wages of the tourism industry, like the hotels and restaurants, to help cushion the impact of COVID-19, and helping keep the employees on payroll so that we're not impacted by it. So that program is helping to cushion our tourism sector as we speak at this moment, and we look forward to COVID-19 subside so that we can come back to the normal. And of course, the U.S. government, we're very grateful and fortunate that the pandemic unemployment assistance program has been extended through the Department of Labor, which is also helping our citizens who have become unemployed because of the COVID-19 emergency declarations that we've put in place. So these programs are helping our country to cushion the impact of COVID-19. And COVID-19 has delayed some of the implementation of the major programs that we are working on. With World Bank, we are working with World Bank to implement climate resilient road infrastructure, which is underway, but it's being delayed because of the COVID-19. Also, our integrated coconut facility in Chuk, which is being built, a major project that's being built to export coconut and create employment, is also slowed down. But when COVID subsides, we are going to resume some of the development initiatives that are underway and ongoing.
Thank you, Mr. President. It sounds like an extremely multifaceted response at the state level, at the national level, and of course, leveraging the great relationships you have with international partners. Now, with your permission, given the time and our ambitious set of topics, may I move along to talk about climate change? Is that okay? Okay, yes. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. President. So can you please share with our audience how climate change is affecting FSM?
Well, climate change, we believe the best examples that we can use is the impact on our outlying atolls in our nation, like I've seen in Solomon Islands, like I've seen in other Pacific Island countries. The impact of climate change is already upon us. Our outer islands, just last week, the governor of Bombay State has asked us for an emergency response to our outermost island of Kapingamarangi. The population there just ran into an emergency situation with water shortage, even food security issues because of the issue of climate change. The bananas and breadfruits, coconuts are drying up. Our taro patches in these islands are also being dried up, and these are food security issues. The issue of rainfall is one that also is hurting them. So we responded by trying to help them with the shortage of water and food security issues that we have. So you can expand that to the other outlying countries that we have, territories that we have within the FSM. That we are being visited with the issues of climate change. And so as a member of the Pacific Islands Forum, as you know, we all came together in the last PIF with the declaration on the fact that climate change is an existential threat for most of us. And we took that to the United Nations, and are calling out to the rest of the world to come on board because this issue of climate change is one that would hurt our planet and not just the Pacific Island countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. For those who live here in the Pacific, I want to thank you for your advocacy and for championing this issue at that global forum at the UN. And also the issue of food security is really sharpened. I think it certainly was an issue before COVID-19, and I think in the Pacific, but particularly in other parts of the world, it's really top of mind for a lot of development agencies. But just focusing on FSM, how has FSM embraced innovation to counter the effects of climate change? And how has biofuel exports factored into this equation?
Thank you for your question, Ambassador Lyons. We've been implementing creative ways of combating, climate change, and among those are solar farms. You yourself, when you were an ambassador of New Zealand, we were fortunate with the assistance of, I believe it was a 1 million that assisted the program from the Karena organization, which donated a lot of the solar panels. So Pone Bay is an example of taking action to lessen our footprint, our carbon footprint. And so solar farm is in Pone Bay helping with that process. ADB, working with the FSM, we prioritize the sectors of energy and transport. So you will see that in the pipeline, we're developing a hydro plant because we have very strong rivers in Pone Bay to lessen the use of fossil fuels. And biofuel, we do have at least 50 homes here in Pone Bay that I can speak of that are using biofuels through the cultural raising of pigs in our island. And so using the waste of pigs, we're able to produce biofuel to many homes in our country that are using it. And those are some of the examples. The Chuk integrated coconut processing facility, when it comes to fruition, we will be exporting, virgin coconut oil. We have been exporting. That's another project that's very promising. And we'll also develop biofuels for vehicles and other types of renewable source that we can count on to help with the climate change.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm glad that we managed to fit that one in, because I think a lot of people would be surprised at just how advanced the innovative approaches are right around the Pacific, but particularly in FSM. So I'm glad we discussed that. And sticking with climate change, back to sort of the international arena, how has climate change, how does that issue affect the Pacific view of larger countries, such as the US, China, and Australia? And then in particular, given current events, I'd love to hear your view of China's recent 2060 climate neutral pledge.
Well, that's very welcome news. I've had the opportunity of visiting the US, United States, and meeting with President Trump and other officials, the presidents of the freely associated states. I've had the opportunity of meeting President Xi in China, Prime Minister Abe. And I'm glad that these countries are really coming forward with serious commitments, because without the participation of the bigger countries with the larger populations and industry, the Pacific Island countries will continue to struggle with the challenge of getting everybody on board to become carbon neutral by 2050. So those who are committing earlier are very welcomed. I know that the European Union, other countries are doing their best to also make serious commitments. So today, like other Pacific Island countries or the Pacific Islands Forum, we call upon United States and other countries to come back on board on the Paris Agreement. to give the kind of serious commitments to implement the Paris Agreement, because we're losing time as we fight issue of climate change. And I've said it when I was at the United Nations, Ambassador, that everybody will be hurt by this forthcoming calamity that we project if we don't unify our actions. Many of those in the West Coast of Hawaii, big investments have been made in the tourism sector that are low-lying on the beaches of California, Hawaii, New York, billions of dollars. And climate change will eventually impact these types of investments. But for the Pacific Island countries, it's more serious because it's an existential threat to most of our populations in the Pacific. And so we continue to call upon the bigger countries to take climate change very, very seriously.
And thank you, Mr. President. And because it is an existential crisis, not just here in the Pacific, but for our planet, but it also is the #1 security issue here in the Pacific, I hope you'll indulge me if I ask another question about climate change, and not just because as the Director of Research, I run a number of climate change programs here that I'm exceptionally proud of, and I should just plug Pacific Research while I have everybody watching. So, sir, in terms of the last point that you just made, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how partner organizations and countries can contribute to Pacific efforts to mitigate climate change.
Yeah, well, every country must take their obligations very seriously. Some of the examples that we've done in the margins of the 74th UNGA last year in New York was to form the coalition with the Blue Prosperity Coalition, which is now called the Blue Prosperity Micronesia. And these are the kind of efforts that we must take it seriously and do it, take action upon ourselves to come out and help with the climate change issues. We partnered with the Blue Prosperity Coalition to form a Blue Prosperity Micronesia to conserve 30% of our, exclusive economic zone by 2030. We are very strong in doing conservation near shore, the marine protected areas throughout the FSM, but that's not enough. Near shore, while it has most of the elements of biodiversity, it's very important, but we have to take that further into our exclusive economic zones. FSM, like many other Pacific Island countries, are largely dependent by way of revenue, by way of subsistence survival on these natural resources, and sustainable development is really important for us because it has been our way of life, and we want to make sure that we protect the natural environment that sustains us, by way of food security, by way of revenues that we are depending on. And so even people in the US and everywhere, the generation now may be dependent on going to the shelves in the supermarkets to buy food, but we know that our food security originates from nature, and it's coming from those type of environments. If we don't jointly and unify our efforts, then the planet would be in serious danger.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's both inspiring, but also very impressive. I think some of my scientists would be impressed at the depth of your knowledge. And I think I'll just take us along. I'm conscious that we've got 13 minutes left. And the last topic we were going to talk about today was FSM's relationship with the United States, which is quite topical right now. And so how would you describe the future state of relations between FSM and the US?
Our relationship with the United States is one that is very enduring, one that is very unique. Our partners in the US are very aware of that. Our relationship is unique. The Compact of Reassociation is, the treaty that really binds us together. And so US is our first and foremost partner, as I have alluded to in my previous statements in the US and elsewhere. And so our relationship is very unique, Ambassador. You can see that. We are currently negotiating with the U.S. for the expiring provisions of the compact, the treaty, which would be expiring in 2023. I think we're going into our third round of engagement with the interagency group, U.S., and it's looking very optimistic. Our target is to look at hopefully submitting a completed package to the U.S. Congress by January of next year, which is really around the corner. But our relationship is more unique. Our citizens, young men and women also serve in the U.S. Armed Forces at the higher per capita than any of the U.S. states. So that's very unique. We want to look at the U.S. as a true partner. We want to invite U.S. investors to come into our country, to be genuine in the partnership of development from here going forward. Our citizens who serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, they're veterans, they come back home. And we also are currently working with them on the issue of veterans benefits so that they can get the eligibility in our country here in the FSM and throughout the freely associated states countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I'll follow up on the topic of Micronesian veterans in just a moment, because it's a very important issue, and particularly one that resonates here in Honolulu. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your relationship with the FSM. The question that I have here is two parts, and I'm tempted to skip the first and go to the juicy bit. The first bit of the question is, what collaborative opportunities would you like to see strengthened between FSM and the United States? But the part of the question that I would love for you to really focus on is, does FSM share the US's concern about China's increased role in the Pacific?
Well, we are a sovereign country, as you know now, and from the beginning when we became an independent nation, Ambassador, U.S. was integral part of our evolution from a territory to what is now a sovereign nation of the Federated States of Micronesia. So our relationship with the U.S. as built in the treaty cooperation through economic engagement, political engagement, and defense-related engagement. So the treaty is very unique. As you know, U.S. has certain denial rights into our airspace and our waters. And that's basically through what we call delegation of some certain authority of our defense obligations to a close ally, the United States, and that's allowed for under international law, as you know. And so we welcome that. We welcome the fact that we continue to engage the U.S. on a very strong collaborative basis. Our young men and women serve in the armed forces. But some of the things we welcome, of course, we continue to have and hold exercises between the freely associated states and the United States in our waters, in our region, in our airspace. That continues to happen, and we will welcome more of those activities. Here in the FSM, also the naval CPs come here, and they do undertake projects that improve our schools, improve our dispensaries, and you can see evidence of that happening in our communities. Of course, we welcome that. And then we welcome U.S. investors who come into our country to invest. When we met the leaders in Washington, D.C., that's one of the topics that we continue to encourage the U.S. And I'd like to see, more involvement of the United States in the infrastructure development of our country. The unique relationship we have with the U.S. is such that I think it also warrants the U.S. Leadership to look at how they can build upon. It's a partnership, build upon some of the shortcomings in our history. We continue to struggle to build our infrastructure. I'm talking about climate resilient roads and bridges that we still struggling to build. These things don't happen overnight. And so I was raising informally with some of the U.S. Officials that I've engaged with recently, even the extension of federal highway funding to be extended to the FSM and the freely associated states, because there's still great need in the development of our infrastructure. And I welcome more talks and engagement with the US and some of the things that may not be part of the compact, but we wish to explore those opportunities with the US in our continuing engagement on compact negotiations.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'm so glad that we're having such an in-depth discussion about the compact itself, because while you know it off by heart, I think a lot of people, even in the Pacific, are not aware that there are that it's such a special relationship with the US, and then enshrined with this treaty that's so multifaceted. For example, the defense elements, which will endure and are not up for negotiation, as you've just outlined. And it just takes me to a part that you touched on earlier, and I think is particularly important, because what's quite sacred almost about the compact is that Micronesians serve in the US military. And I would like to hear a little bit about that, given their sacrifice and then some of the unique challenges that Micronesian veterans face.
Well, this issue has been a long-standing one, Ambassador Lyons. You know, our relationship provides meetings between our two countries, the joint committee meeting that is held annually with the U.S. Representatives from defense, from the embassy, to talk about compact-related issues. I was fortunate, of course, the meeting with President Trump led to other meetings with Secretary Wilkie, the Secretary of Department of Veterans Affairs. He came here, visited the FSM, met with the veterans. And so that issue was brought to the attention of the U.S., and we continue to work on that. There's currently in the U.S. Congress the Cova Veterans Review Act, and I know this is an issue for U.S. Congress to enact. And we again call upon our friends in the U.S. to look at that specific act, and we hope that that can be, one of the actions to be taken by the U.S. leadership, because we sacrifice our young men and women. If you come to the FSM, one of the first things you're going to notice is the fallen soldiers at our airport. During every holiday of the Veterans Day, we do our, visit to these fallen soldiers to express our, our respects to these individuals who have taken the ultimate sacrifice in the fight for rule of law, freedom, and liberty of both the U.S. FSM and the global community to keep peace and security.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your time today. We've actually almost come up to the end of our allotment, and you've been very generous with your time. I wondered if there was any last thing that you wanted to share with our audience before I close us off for this time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ambassador Lyons. Audience out there are good friends of the Federated States of Micronesia. You have been partners. I think you raised the issue of regionalism. Multilateralism also is a very important way of cooperation in our small global community now, with the bigger challenges that we continue to face. COVID-19 has really taught us a lot more and made us more acutely aware of the, first of all, the type of opportunities that we have. I think it brings into focus first the opportunities that we have and how we can collaborate in fighting against COVID-19. But the global community needs to come together to fight climate change. Doing it in isolation is not going to be the answer. On the environment, many of you we've engaged in the past, even in Hawaii and at the United Nations. So we look forward to looking at cooperating with all of you. And as a country, we again, as is embedded in our Constitution, we extend to all of you what we seek from each, and that is peace, friendship, cooperation and love in our common humanity. I think in these challenging times, unprecedented times, that's what I would like to call upon, that we closely work together for the good of our respective countries, for the good of the region, and for the good of our global community. So we thank you and express our sincere appreciation for the close support and partnership, collaboration with all of you out there. And I again thank you, Ambassador Lyons, for the opportunity to say a few words here in the effort of working together for the good of our nations and our global community.
Well,
thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Mr. President. It was a fascinating discussion, and I knew that it would be, and how fitting that you would close us off with those inspiring and heartwarming words, which a lot of us really need right now. So, sir, on behalf of the Pacific Islands Development Program and the East-West Center, and of course our audience tuning in from around the world, I want to thank you so very much for your time and for your candor. Kalangan, Kalangan.
Thank you, Ambassador Lyons.
And thanks to our audience for joining us.